In 1979, a young accountant named Gary Jarofyan walked into the sprawling campus of the PTL Club in Charlotte, North Carolina, expecting to audit what appeared to be one of the most successful religious broadcasting empires in American history. What he found instead would haunt him for decades. Hidden within the labyrinthine financial records of Jim and Tammy Faye Backer's ministry was something that defied comprehension. A secret network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and mysterious donors whose money flowed through channels so complex that even seasoned forensic accountants would later describe them as deliberately designed to be impenetrable. Drahan didn't know it then, but he had just stumbled upon the tip of an iceberg that stretched across continents, connected some of the wealthiest families in America, and would eventually expose a pattern of financial manipulation that had been quietly funding the explosive growth of American megachurches since the 1950s. But here's what makes this story truly unsettling. The PTL scandal, which would eventually see Jim Backer sentenced to 45 years in federal prison, wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't even the most egregious example, it was simply the one that got caught. Behind the gleaming facades of America's fastest-growing churches, behind the celebrity pastors with their private jets and oceanfront mansions, behind the stadium-sized sanctuaries that seemed to multiply overnight across the American landscape, there existed a shadow financial system that most congregants never knew about, and that federal regulators were often powerless to investigate. The story I'm about to tell you involves billionaire oil magnates, covert political operatives, foreign governments, organized crime figures, and a religious exemption loophole so vast that it essentially created an unregulated financial sector operating in plain sight within the United States. It's a story about how genuine religious movements became vehicles for tax evasion, money laundering, and political influence campaigns. And perhaps most disturbingly, it's a story about how the victims were often the faithful believers who tithed their modest incomes, never suspecting that their donations were funding lifestyles that would make Roman emperors blush. Before I continue, let me ask you something. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching this from and what time it is there. I'm genuinely curious about how far this story is traveling. Also, what do you do for work? I've noticed Professor Archive has viewers from incredibly diverse backgrounds, and I'd love to know who's along for this journey today. If you've been enjoying our deep dives into the hidden corners of history, consider hitting that subscribe button. And if this video particularly resonates with you, a super thanks goes a long way toward helping us produce more extensively researched content like this. Now, let me take you back to where this all truly began. The roots of America's church financing scandal stretch back to a moment that most historians have overlooked. In 1954, a relatively obscure amendment was added to the Internal Revenue Code. It was called the Johnson Amendment, named after then-Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, and it prohibited tax-exempt organizations, including churches, from directly participating in political campaigns. But hidden within the legislative language was something else entirely, a provision that essentially made churches the least audited entities in America. Unlike other nonprofits, churches were not required to file the standard Form 990, which discloses financial information to the public. Churches didn't have to reveal their income, their expenditures, their executive compensation, or anything else about how they handled money. They were, in effect, financial black boxes. For legitimate religious organizations operating in good faith, this wasn't particularly problematic. A small Baptist church in rural Georgia collecting a few $1,000s in tithes each month didn't need extensive federal oversight. But as post-war America entered an era of unprecedented prosperity, and as the nascent technology of television began transforming how Americans consumed media, a handful of religious entrepreneurs recognized an extraordinary opportunity. The combination of religious tax exemption and minimal reporting requirements had created a legal framework that was essentially an invitation to build vast financial empires with virtually no outside scrutiny. The first person to truly exploit this loophole on a massive scale was a man named Rex Humbard. In 1958, Humbard built the Cathedral of Tomorrow in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, a 5,400-seat megachurch that cost over $4 million, an astronomical sum at the time. What made Humbard's operation revolutionary wasn't just its scale, it was how he financed it. Humbard created a complex web of subsidiary organizations, each technically separate but all ultimately controlled by his family. There was Rex Humbard Ministries, which handled donations. There was the Cathedral of Tomorrow itself, which owned the real estate. There was Rex Humbard Productions, which handled the television broadcasts. And there were several other entities whose purposes were never clearly defined. Money flowed between these organizations in ways that even Humbard's own staff struggled to track. When questions eventually arose about the cathedral's finances in the 1970s, investigators discovered something remarkable. Despite taking in tens of millions of dollars in donations from viewers who believed they were supporting evangelical outreach, the ministry had accumulated massive debts while simultaneously paying the Humbard family salaries and benefits that totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. The Cathedral of Tomorrow eventually defaulted on its loans, and the building was sold to a television shopping network. But by then, Humbard's financial architecture had been studied and refined by a new generation of televangelists who would take these techniques to levels even Humbard hadn't imagined. Which brings us to a name that will recur throughout this story: Richard DeVos. The co-founder of Amway, DeVos was one of the wealthiest men in America during the latter half of the 20th century, and he was also one of the most prolific donors to evangelical causes. On the surface, this was simply a wealthy Christian businessman supporting ministries he believed in. But the reality was far more complex. DeVos didn't simply write checks to churches. He created an intricate network of foundations, trusts, and donor-advised funds that allowed him and other wealthy donors to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously: massive tax deductions, influence over church leadership, and in some cases what amounted to a financial return on their religious investments. Through vehicles like the Richard and Helen DeVos Foundation, money flowed to evangelical organizations with specific expectations attached. DeVos sat on the boards of organizations that then channeled money to other organizations where he had financial interests. The result was a closed loop where religious donations effectively became a form of investment capital. Here's a specific example that illustrates how this worked. In the early 1980s, the DeVos family donated substantial sums to a small Bible college. That college then encouraged its students to become Amway distributors. The college purchased its supplies through Amway-affiliated vendors, and a portion of the profits from those transactions flowed back through the network to entities that the DeVos family controlled. Was this illegal? The IRS never brought charges, but it was a sophisticated form of what might be called religious arbitrage, using the tax-exempt status of churches and religious organizations to create financial advantages that wouldn't have been possible in the for-profit world. The DeVos operation was notable for its sophistication, but it was far from unique. Across America, a shadow network of wealthy donors was quietly shaping the trajectory of American Christianity through strategic giving that served both spiritual and financial purposes. These donors didn't simply fund churches. They funded specific types of churches that promoted specific theological and political positions. And they did so through channels so complex that tracing the money required forensic accounting expertise that most church members didn't possess. One of the most influential figures in this shadow network was a man named Howard Amundsen Jr. The heir to a savings and loan fortune, Amundsen used his wealth to fund a theological movement called Christian Reconstructionism, which advocated for biblical law as the basis of civil government. Between the 1970s and the 2000s, Amundsen channeled tens of millions of dollars through a foundation called Fieldstead and Company to churches, seminaries, and political organizations that promoted Reconstructionist ideas. But Amundsen didn't simply donate money. He structured his giving through a complex array of intermediary organizations that obscured the ultimate source and purpose of the funds. When investigative journalists eventually traced some of these donations, they discovered that churches receiving Amundsen money often underwent dramatic transformations. Pastors who questioned Reconstructionist theology were quietly replaced. Church governing boards were restructured to give donor-aligned members greater control. And the churches themselves became nodes in a larger network that could be activated for political purposes while still maintaining their tax-exempt status. This was, in effect, a hostile takeover of American religious institutions, conducted not through force but through the strategic deployment of tax-advantaged capital. But the domestic donor networks, however sophisticated, were only part of the story. Perhaps the most explosive revelation to emerge from investigating church growth scandals involved money that didn't originate in the United States at all. In 2003, a Treasury Department investigation that has never been fully made public uncovered evidence that several prominent American megachurches had received substantial funding from sources in South Korea, Singapore, and the oil-rich nations of the Persian Gulf. The investigation, which was eventually closed without criminal charges, revealed that some of this foreign money had entered the United States through a series of intermediary organizations designed to obscure its origins. The Treasury investigators suspected, but could never definitively prove, that at least some of this money represented an attempt by foreign governments to gain influence over American religious and political discourse. Consider the case of David Yonggi Cho, the founder of Yoido Full Gospel Church in Seoul, South Korea, which at its peak was the largest church in the world with over 800,000 members. In 2014, Cho was convicted by South Korean courts of embezzling $12 million from his church. But that conviction represented only a fraction of the money that investigators believed had passed through Cho's extensive international network. Yodo Full Gospel Church had sister church relationships with dozens of American megachurches, and these relationships involved substantial financial transfers that moved in both directions across the Pacific. The money that flowed from South Korea to American churches came from various sources. Some of it represented legitimate donations from Korean Christians who wanted to support the global spread of Christianity. But some of it, investigators believed, originated with South Korean business conglomerates and government-connected entities that viewed the American evangelical movement as a useful vehicle for promoting South Korean interests in the United States. These entities made donations to Korean churches, which then transferred money to their American partner churches, which then used that money for purposes that aligned with Korean foreign policy objectives. The American churches, in turn, became vocal advocates for South Korean positions on issues ranging from trade policy to military alliances. Was this foreign influence campaign? The Treasury Department couldn't prove it in court, but the pattern was unmistakable. Foreign money entering the American religious system through channels that were virtually impossible for regulators to monitor, then being used to shape American public opinion on issues that mattered to the foreign donors. The South Korean connection was relatively benign compared to what investigators discovered about money flows from the Middle East. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, several American evangelical organizations received large donations from wealthy individuals in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. This seems counterintuitive. Why would wealthy Muslims fund Christian evangelism? The answer reveals just how cynical some of the financial manipulation had become. The evangelical organizations receiving this money were ones that promoted particularly apocalyptic interpretations of Christianity, including the belief that a final battle between Christianity and Islam was prophetically inevitable. From the perspective of certain Middle Eastern interests, funding these extremist Christian voices served a dual purpose. It deepened divisions within American society, and it promoted a view of Islam as an eternal enemy that made nuanced diplomacy more difficult. In effect, foreign actors were using American churches as vehicles to spread viewpoints that served foreign interests, and they were able to do so because the lack of financial transparency in the religious sector made it nearly impossible to trace the money. But perhaps no scandal better illustrates the full scope of the secret networks funding American church growth than the collapse of the Trinity Broadcasting Network's inner circle in the 2010s. Paul and John Crouch built TBN into the world's largest religious broadcasting network, with an estimated annual revenue exceeding $100 million at its peak. From their headquarters in Costa Mesa, California, the Crouches presided over a media empire that included multiple television networks, theme parks, and production facilities around the world. They also controlled a financial network so complex that forensic accountants would later describe it as deliberately designed to prevent outside understanding. When Paul Crouch died in 2013 and the subsequent family legal battles exposed decades of financial records, the revelations were staggering. The Crouches had used donations from viewers, many of them elderly and living on fixed incomes, to fund a lifestyle that included 30 homes and estates, a personal fleet of private jets, and a $100,000 mobile home for Jan Crouch's dogs. But the personal excesses were almost beside the point compared to the structural corruption that the records revealed. TBN had created a network of more than 30 subsidiary organizations, many of them based in countries with strong financial secrecy laws. Money donated to TBN in the United States was transferred to these foreign entities, which then used the money for purposes that bore no relationship to religious broadcasting. Some of the money went to real estate investments, some went to businesses controlled by Crouch family members, and some, investigators believed, simply disappeared into accounts that were never properly traced. More troubling still was the discovery that TBN had functioned as a hub for financial transfers involving other televangelists and megachurch pastors. Smaller ministries would send money to TBN in exchange for airtime, but the financial arrangements were structured in ways that allowed both parties to manipulate their reported income and expenditures. In effect, TBN had become a clearinghouse for financial manipulation across the entire televangelist industry. The IRS eventually revoked the tax-exempt status of some TBN subsidiaries, but the core organization survived. No criminal charges were ever filed against the Crouch family. And despite the scandals, TBN continues to operate today, still soliciting donations from viewers who may or may not be aware of the network's financial history. The TBN revelations prompted investigators to look more closely at other mega ministries, and what they found suggested that the Crouch's financial architecture, while extreme, was not unique. Consider the case of Kenneth Copeland, whose Kenneth Copeland Ministries is based in Newark, Texas, on a compound that includes a private airport with a 20,000-foot runway capable of accommodating commercial aircraft. Copeland owns multiple private jets, including a Gulfstream fee that cost approximately $20 million. When asked by journalists how he could justify such expenditures, Copeland has explained that the jets are necessary for his ministry work and that commercial air travel would expose him to demons. The IRS has never publicly challenged Copeland's tax-exempt status, despite the apparent use of donation money for personal luxury items. Or consider Joyce Meyer Ministries, which in 2009 was investigated by Senator Chuck Grassley as part of a broader examination of televangelist finances. Meyer's ministry had purchased a $2 million home for her, along with a $20,000 conference table, an $11,000 French clock, and other luxury items. When Grassley's investigation requested detailed financial information from Meyer and 5 other televangelists, 4 of them, including Meyer, refused to cooperate. The investigation ended without legislative action, and the televangelists continued operating as before. These individual cases, however troubling, point to a larger systemic problem: the almost complete absence of meaningful oversight of church finances in the United States. The IRS is technically authorized to audit churches, but the process is so cumbersome that it almost never happens. Before auditing a church, the IRS must have evidence of potential violations, must have the audit approved by a high-ranking Treasury official, must give the church written notice explaining the concerns, and must follow other procedural requirements that don't apply to audits of other organizations. The result is that churches are audited at a rate far below that of other tax-exempt organizations, and the audits that do occur rarely result in serious consequences. This regulatory vacuum has created what might be called a market for church tax exemption. Attorneys who specialize in religious organization law openly advertise their services to businesses and individuals who want to reduce their tax burden by reorganizing as churches. A 2022 investigation by journalists at Como News in Seattle found advertisements offering to help clients establish church franchises that would allow them to claim religious tax exemption while continuing to operate what were essentially secular businesses. The IRS has occasionally challenged these arrangements, but the standard for what constitutes a legitimate church is so vague that the agency loses most of the cases it brings. The consequences of this regulatory failure extend far beyond individual tax evasion. The lack of financial transparency in the religious sector has created conditions that are ideal for money laundering. Criminal organizations seeking to move money without detection have recognized that churches offer a nearly perfect vehicle: large cash flows, minimal reporting requirements, and the social legitimacy that comes with religious status. In 2019, federal prosecutors in New York charged a network of individuals with laundering millions of dollars through a Brooklyn-based church. The scheme was relatively simple. Drug money was delivered to the church as cash donations. The church issued receipts claiming the money was charitable giving, and the laundered money was then transferred to accounts controlled by the criminal network. The church's leadership claimed to have been unaware that the donations came from drug sales, and prosecutors were unable to prove otherwise. The case illustrated both the vulnerability of churches to exploitation by criminal networks and the difficulty of prosecuting cases where criminal intent is hard to establish. Similar schemes have been uncovered across the country. In 2017, a Florida church was implicated in a money laundering operation connected to healthcare fraud. In 2020, a California church was found to have been used as a conduit for funds connected to a pyramid scheme. In each case, the lack of financial transparency made it easy for criminals to infiltrate religious organizations and difficult for law enforcement to detect the activity. But the financial scandals affecting American churches aren't limited to criminal enterprises exploiting religious organizations from outside. In many cases, the exploitation comes from within, perpetrated by church leaders who view their congregations as personal financial resources. The phenomenon of pastoral compensation has become one of the most contentious issues in American Christianity. According to research by the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, the median salary for senior pastors at megachurches exceeds $250,000 annually, with many pastors receiving compensation packages worth more than $1 million when housing allowances, retirement contributions, and other benefits are included. These figures don't include income from book deals, speaking engagements, and other activities that many megachurch pastors engage in. The theological justification for this compensation is often drawn from what's called prosperity gospel theology, which holds that God rewards faithful believers with material wealth. Under this framework, a pastor's personal prosperity is evidence of divine blessing and spiritual authority. Critics of prosperity theology argue that it represents a fundamental distortion of Christian teaching, but its prevalence among America's largest churches has made it a significant factor in church finance. The prosperity gospel has also created a feedback loop that encourages financial abuse. Pastors teach that wealth is a sign of God's favor. Congregants donate generously, hoping to receive similar blessings. The pastor uses the donations to fund an increasingly lavish lifestyle, and the pastor's visible wealth is then presented as evidence that the prosperity teaching works, encouraging even more generous donations. The result is a system where pastoral compensation can spiral upward without limit, constrained only by the pastor's willingness to claim ever larger portions of church income for personal use. Some of the most egregious examples of pastoral self-dealing have involved real estate transactions. Church leaders have used donation money to purchase properties that are then leased back to the church or sold at inflated prices. In some cases, pastors have had their personal homes purchased by the church, then arranged for the church to sell the homes back to them at below-market prices. These transactions are often structured through intermediary entities that make them difficult to detect. In 2016, investigators discovered that the pastor of a prominent Chicago-area megachurch had arranged for the church to purchase a $10 million estate in Texas that was then designated as a pastoral retreat center. The retreat center was available for the pastor's exclusive personal use and was maintained using church funds. When congregants raised questions about the transaction, they were told that the arrangement was necessary for the pastor's spiritual renewal, and that questioning it demonstrated a lack of faith. Several congregants who persisted in their questions were asked to leave the church. This pattern of silencing dissent has emerged as a common feature of churches where financial abuse occurs. Church governance structures often concentrate power in the hands of pastoral leadership, with minimal accountability to congregants. When questions arise about financial practices, pastors can invoke spiritual authority to deflect criticism. Congregants who persist in raising questions are accused of sowing division or demonstrating a lack of faith. And in extreme cases, critics are formally excommunicated from the church, losing not just their religious community but often their social network as well. The psychological dynamics at play in these situations are powerful. For many congregants, their church is the center of their social life. Their closest friends are church members. Their children attend church schools. Their business relationships are often with fellow congregants. Raising questions about church finances risks losing all of these relationships. For most people, the cost of speaking out is simply too high. These dynamics help explain why financial abuse in churches often continues for years or even decades before being exposed. The PTL scandal that I mentioned at the beginning of this video had been ongoing for at least a decade before it became public. The TBN scandal involved practices that had been in place for 30 years. In many cases, whistleblowers who eventually exposed church financial abuse describe years of internal concern before finally deciding to go public. The legal framework for addressing church financial abuse is also remarkably weak. Unlike publicly traded corporations, which must report detailed financial information to securities regulators, or charitable organizations, which must file public tax returns, churches operate with essentially no public reporting requirements. Congregants who suspect financial abuse often have no legal right to see church financial records. And even when abuse is documented, the legal remedies are limited. In most states, church members have no standing to sue for recovery of misused donations. Courts have generally held that donations become the property of the church once they're made, and donors cannot dictate how those funds are used. Prosecutors can bring criminal charges for fraud or embezzlement, but these charges require proving that a church leader made specific misrepresentations to donors, which is often difficult to establish. The result is that church leaders who misuse funds face legal consequences only in the most extreme cases. This legal immunity has attracted a certain type of entrepreneur to the religious sector. Investigators have documented cases of individuals with histories of securities fraud, bankruptcy, or other financial misconduct who subsequently established churches, apparently viewing the religious sector as a refuge from the regulatory scrutiny they faced in secular business. The lack of background check requirements for church leaders combined with the minimal financial reporting obligations creates an environment where bad actors can operate with relative impunity. The growth of online giving has added another dimension to church financial scandals. Before the advent of electronic payments, churches collected donations primarily through cash and checks, which at least provided some documentation of who was giving and how much. Today, many churches receive a substantial portion of their income through online giving platforms, mobile apps, and cryptocurrency donations. These digital payment channels can be configured in ways that make tracking the flow of money even more difficult than traditional collection methods. Some churches have used online giving to create tiered donation systems that would have been difficult to implement with the traditional collection methods. Premium donors receive special access to church leadership, preferred seating, and other benefits.